I hope you enjoy this hero's journey into the realm of philosophy, psychology, and physics. If you want to help me create more content like this, please subscribe and consider sponsoring me here on YouTube. I also want to thank the Platonic Mystery School of the Divine Infinite Being for sponsoring this course, and you can check that school out at divineinfinitebeing.com. Footnotes to Plato. The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. So that's Alfred North Whitehead, a mathematician and philosopher, in his book Process and Reality, but that's a famous quote that European philosophy since Plato is a series of footnotes to Plato. Everything everyone else wrote about after Plato is just expanding upon some fundamental point that Plato already talked about in his dialogues. So I'm going to be going over in the next few slides Plato's dialogue, the Symposium, where he has a priestess Diotima talk about the fear of death. And we'll be going over Plato's dialogues extensively in subsequent videos. Plato's Symposium, Diotima on Love and the Passion for Immortality. So the Symposium, Plato wrote this dialogue. So Plato was the disciple of Socrates. Socrates lived in Athens, was executed in 399 BC on charges of corrupting the youth and believing in gods of his own invention instead of the gods recognized by the state. We'll be going over all the fundamentals of Socrates' biography throughout the series. But one of Socrates' students was Plato, who then wrote the famous dialogues featuring Socrates discussing fundamental philosophical questions with the people of Athens. In this dialogue, the Symposium, it's a feast, a banquet, and they decided that they were going to spend the night discussing the nature of love. And came to Socrates' turn, he said, "Let me recount to you the lessons on love that I heard from the priestess Diotima." So this is Socrates recalling what he heard from Diotima. When it came to Socrates' turn, he recalled the lessons on love that he learned from the priestess Diotima. So the subtitle for this slide is Diotima on Love and the Passion for Immortality. And we'll see here how Diotima explains that the fear of death and the love of immortality is what drives human beings the most. This is supporting what Ernest Becker said in The Denial of Death, the fundamental theme of this whole class, immortality and the unreality of death. That to have self-knowledge, we have to know what drives human beings the most, what drives each of us the most. And we'll see here that Plato is recounting Socrates, recounting Diotima's lessons on this very issue. So let me just read a few pertinent excerpts from Plato's Symposium. Now this is Socrates, and he's quoting Diotima. "Love never longs for either half or the whole of anything except the good." So the idea of the good is a fundamental, the source of all being, the absolute idea of the good for Socrates via Plato, and we'll be coming back to that repeatedly. But she starts off by saying that people love, the only thing people really love is the good. So to support that claim, she says, "For men will have their hands and feet cut off. If they are once convinced those members are bad for them." So if you think that you have a wound, this was ancient Greece, and all the citizens of Athens fought in their own battles, and so they're aware of situations where you might have a suppurating wound on your leg or your hands or your feet, and you'll have them cut off if you think it's going to spread to the rest of your body and kill you. So to achieve the good, we're willing to endure all sorts of bad things if it's for the greater good. But she's going to link the idea of the good with immortality, as we're going to see. "And why all this longing for propagation? Because it is the one deathless and eternal element in our mortality. And since we have agreed that the lover longs for the good to be his own forever, it follows that we are bound to long for immortality as well as the good, which is to say that love is a longing for immortality." So this longing for propagation, the sex impulse. Why is it so strong in the human species and so many other species? Because it's linked to the soul's longing to have the good forever. So wouldn't be good if you couldn't have it forever. So the longing for the good is also a longing for immortality. And sex is the only way that the body can achieve that, as she's going to explain. This, my dear Socrates, is how the body and all that is temporal partakes of eternal. There is no other way, and so it is no wonder that every creature prizes its own issue, since the whole creation is inspired by this love, this passion for immortality. So there you have a very bold claim. The whole creation is inspired by this love, this passion for immortality. Plato's Symposium, longing for the endless fame. So that's a quote from Diotima. So continuing with Socrates' quotes of Diotima, men's great incentive is the love of glory, and that their one idea is to win eternal mention in the deathless roll of fame. So in the dialogues, Plato depicts Socrates quoting from literature such as Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey, or the tragedians such as Euripides or Aeschylus or Sophocles, and various tragic plays or comic plays. So this is a quote, to win eternal mention in the deathless roll of fame. I don't know what ancient source Socrates is depicting Diotima quoting from, but the fundamental point for this class is that the great incentive is our love of glory and to have this eternal fame. Nothing less than that will satisfy the human soul. To realize that fact can help us achieve happiness in life. Continuing here in the Symposium, Diotima says, for the sake of fame, they will dare greater dangers, even than for their children. They are ready to spend their money like water and to wear their fingers to the bone, and if it comes to that, to die. So people are willing to die to win eternal mention in the deathless roll of fame. You're willing to allow your material body to die if you think doing so will grant you eternal fame, because the soul strives for eternality. That's the fundamental drive. The fundamental drive is for the good, and that includes a love of immortality, because you want what is good forever. Continuing here, do you think that Alcestis would have laid down her life to save Admetus, or that Achilles would have died for the love he bore Patroclus, if they had not hoped to win the deathless name for valor, which in fact posterity had granted them? So he's referring to ancient Greek legends. Alcestis laid her life down to save her husband Admetus, and the warrior Achilles risked his life for his, I believe, cousin Patroclus. But the point is, the great heroes of history, according to Diotima, performed their heroics so that they would be remembered as heroes forever. It's the love of immortality. Continuing with Diotima's quotes, every one of us, no matter what he does, is longing for the endless fame, the incomparable glory that is theirs, and the nobler he is, the greater his ambition, because he is in love with the eternal. So every one of us, she says, and we'll see Socrates says, I wholeheartedly agree with what Diotima says, every one of us is longing for endless fame. That's what this class is focused on. How can we achieve endless fame in the eyes of God? That is what will satisfy the human soul, and nothing less than that will fully satisfy a human being. So continuing here, the analysis of Plato's Symposium, the heavenly ladder of love. This is where Diotima will discuss Plato's most theory of these absolute ideas. So Plato's theory of absolute ideas is that the material world is like a shadow of the eternal spiritual world. And every material form, which is temporary, they come into existence and then they decay and they go. Every material form is a projection from some eternal perfect form in the spiritual world. These perfect forms can only be perceived with the eye of the soul. And the way to open the eye of the soul to these perfect forms, the ultimate form of which in Plato's dialogue, The Republic, is called the idea of the good. Here in the Symposium, it's the idea of beauty and the good. It alternates. But the absolute form of all being, the way to open your eye of your soul to that is to start on the lower rungs of the ladder by observing the temporary material forms, and then learning how they can be traced back to their eternal sources in the spiritual world. So we'll turn now to Diotima. She says, and this is the way, the only way he must approach or be led toward the sanctuary of love, starting from individual beauties The quest for the universal beauty must find him ever mounting the heavenly ladder, stepping from rung to rung, that is, from 1 to 2, and from 2 to every lovely body, from bodily beauty to the beauty of institutions, from institutions to learning, and from learning in general to the special lore that pertains to nothing but beauty itself, until at last he comes to know what beauty is. All right, the heavenly ladder of love. So first you learn to appreciate the beauty of individual forms, individual flowers, individual sunsets, individual people. And she focuses mostly on the beauty of individual people, and how you fall in love with somebody because you find that person to be beautiful. Well, that's the first run. Then you have to learn to see beauty in every physical form. Oh, that person is beautiful, so is this person. Okay, that's interesting. What is it about these people that makes me classify them as beautiful? What is beauty itself? What is it that every beautiful thing participates in to make it worthy of being called beauty? To open the eye of your soul to beauty itself, that is the goal of philosophy. So continuing here with Diotima, she says, "If it were given to man to see the heavenly beauty face to face, would you call his, she asked me, an unenviable life? And when he has brought forth and reared this perfect virtue, he shall be called the friend of God. And if ever it is given to man to put on immortality, it shall be given to him." So to see the heavenly beauty face to face, Diotima asked Socrates, how could that be anything but an enviable life? People should envy the person who has seen heavenly beauty face to face. Then you'll be called the friend of God, and then you'll put on immortality. So to become immortal, you have to see God face to face. The heavenly beauty face to face. Does God have a face? Is that just poetic metaphor? That's an important philosophical question. As we'll see, the Vedanta philosophy, certain schools of Vedanta philosophy believe that the Supreme Person does have a face. In the Vaishnava Vishnu-worshipping branch of Hinduism, the Supreme Person is called Vishnu, and Vishnu's female counterpart Lakshmi. And the goal of that branch of Vedanta philosophy is to see God face to face. And doing so will release you from the cycle of material reincarnation from one temporary material body to the next, so that you can return to your eternal spiritual form. Plato does not so specifically say that God has a spiritual face, although he implies as much in several places in the Symposium, but I'm not going to get into the details of that in this broader class. But Plato does believe in reincarnation. He does believe in an eternal realm of absolute spiritual forms. So just being aware of this basic Platonic Vedic cosmology will help us understand the worldview within which it becomes plausible to believe that you can be a cosmic hero appreciated by God for your heroics on the world stage. So continuing still with Plato's Symposium, everyone should worship the God of love. So now this is Socrates recapping the lessons he learned from Diotima to his friends at the banquet. "This, Phaedrus, this gentleman, was the doctrine of Diotima. I was convinced, and in that conviction I try to bring others to the same creed, and to convince them that, if we are to make this gift our own, love will help our mortal nature more than all the world. And this is why I say that every man of us should worship the God of love, and this is why I cultivate and worship all the elements of love myself, and bid others do the same, and all my life I shall pay the power and the might of love such homage as I can." So worshiping the God of love is the way to achieve immortality. And recalling the ladder of love, you can approach God, the absolute perfect form, which Plato calls the idea of the good in the Republic, as I mentioned before, first by seeing how that ultimate absolute form, from which all the other absolute archetypal forms radiate, how they are all reflected in the temporary material forms that surround us. You start climbing the ladder by observing beautiful things around you, and then you narrow down to the idea of beauty itself. And beauty is good. It's an attribute of the more encompassing idea of the good, which I equate with Carl Jung's archetype of the self, or the God archetype, which I equate with the gravitational singularity, this infinitely bright source of everything, this eternal point of infinite power from which everything radiates. The universal drive for immortality. Motivation to study physics, philosophy, and psychology. It might seem too difficult to study the evolution of physics, philosophy, and psychology just to be well-read. Why bother? If our psychological health demands that we deny death as our true fate by seeing ourselves as immortal, cosmic heroes serving God eternally, and if it is true that to do that, we must either realize or somehow trick ourselves into believing in the empirical truth of a theistic cosmology that allows for such heroics, then knowing those facts about our human condition should allow us to harness the universal drive for immortality to fuel the Herculean effort of learning these complex ideas. So we went over Plato's Symposium so that Diotima could psych us up for studying about immortality and the unreality of death. It's the fundamental human drive. We strive for the good forever, so we strive for immortality. There's no other way that the human being can have psychological health other than addressing this fundamental human impulse, which is a desire for immortal glory, says Diotima, and Socrates wholeheartedly agreed with her. So if that is the case, and if our full blossoming as a human being demands that we truly believe that we are cosmic heroes serving God eternally, well, then we have to address the problems, the obstacles that prevent us from believing that. And that's what this class will help you do. So here, returning to Ernest Becker's The Denial of Death, here's the obstacles, he say, that confront the modern person trying to believe in what he calls an immortality ideology. 3 obstacles to a new immortality ideology. That quote comes from Ernest Becker. That's what he calls religious worldviews that enable us to believe we are immortal servants of a supreme God. According to Becker, number 1, here's the first obstacle. We cannot just invent the kind of living myth ritual complexes we require, for then we will never believe it is true. All religious cultures of the past evolved gradually with the people over many generations. So the first obstacle is you can't just invent a religion. If you invent a religion, you know you invented it, you know that it's a fiction, and you won't believe it. The reason people can believe religions that seem to say incredible things that are impossible to believe is that they've been handed down generation over generation, and they become embedded in the cultural mind. So if you can't find an ancient religion that you believe with, it's difficult to believe in any religion. Now, all religions started at some point, so it's not to say that it's impossible for a new religion to emerge, but if you knowingly create one just to fulfill your striving for immortality, then Becker's saying, obviously, you won't really believe in it. So the second obstacle to creating a new immortality ideology is that we cannot each retreat into a private religion of our own design because, as social creatures, we require a communal belief structure in order to help carry the living illusion, that's a quote from Becker, the living illusion of God and the soul into tangible cultural reality. So Becker isn't saying that there is no God, he's not saying that there is a God. What he's saying is that the advancement of psychology has revealed to us, whether God exists or not, belief in God is the only thing that can really satisfy the human soul, because that belief is required to believe that we are immortal cosmic heroes. There has to be some worthy audience for our cosmic heroics, and that's the eternal, omnipotent God. So we can't each retreat into our own private religion. Everybody, I believe, by default has their own private religion, because even if you subscribe to one of the existing religions, you necessarily interpret it through your own subjective opinion. So it's going to be at least slightly different than everyone else's subjective interpretation. But the main point here is that you can't just believe in your own private religion, even if you do believe in it, that the fullest expression of human happiness won't be had unless others in your social circle agree with you about this immortality ideology, at least on some fundamental points. We are social creatures. We require collective dramas of immortality, says Ernest Becker. So the third obstacle to a new immortality ideology is the analytic strength of the scientific mind makes believing in any spiritual mythology practically impossible for most educated people, even those skeptics who desperately want to believe. So before the scientific revolution, people could explain the natural world using mythology. And in the absence of a better explanation, people would accept it. Okay, that makes sense. The world is existing on the back of a turtle, and whatever your religious cosmology might tell you is reality. It's easier to believe if you don't have empirical scientific evidence saying otherwise. But in the wake of the scientific revolution, a lot of people started dismissing the ancient religions because they didn't harmonize with what science was revealing. So that's, even if you want to believe in God, you're saying, I love to believe in this omnipotent spiritual force, but science seems to indicate that that's a fairy tale. So those are the three obstacles which I'm saying that my book, Psyche and Singularity, will help us overcome. Psyche and Singularity, the alpha and omega of immortality ideologies. Psyche and Singularity overcomes the three obstacles to cultural renewal through collective mythology that Becker spells out. First, it demonstrates how the Psyche equals Singularity equation represents the culminating union of psychology and physics, both of which emerged from the academic history stemming back to Plato, whose philosophical cosmology mirrors and was probably influenced by the Vedanta philosophy of India. So the first obstacle to believing in an immortality ideology is that we can't just invent a new religion of our own. And I'm saying, but it would be plausible for people to believe that Psyche equals Singularity because psychology and physics, as academic fields, both can be traced back to Plato, who established the first academy in the olive grove just north of Athens called Academia. Furthermore, Christianity was interwoven with Plato's dialogues, beginning especially with St. Augustine, as we'll discuss in later videos, and Plato's dialogues themselves seem to be inspired by the Vedanta philosophy of India. So the major religions of the East and the West have both been, well, the major religions of the West have been interwoven with Plato, and Plato's dialogues are famously similar to the Vedic dialogues, such as the Bhagavad Gita and the Bhagavad Purana. So this Psyche equals Singularity equation, you can see it's rooted back to the ground of the evolution of Western religion. And if Plato's dialogues were inspired by the Vedanta philosophy of India, as Ralph Waldo Emerson believed, and as Friedrich Nietzsche and Arthur Schopenhauer and others, and Thoreau, if that's the case, then Psyche equals Singularity is just restating this ancient cosmology. That's why I call it the alpha and omega of immortality ideologies. It is an equation that encapsulates Plato's philosophy and the Vedanta philosophy, and it's come to us through the academic evolution stemming back to Plato and culminating with Carl Jung and Leonard Susskind. So the second obstacle that Psyche and Singularity overcomes on the path towards believing in immortality ideology is that it demonstrates how the Psyche equals Singularity equation resurrects the Platonic Vedic cosmology from which it stems. So I discussed that while discussing the first point. The first obstacle is you can't just retreat into your own private religion. And I'm saying Psyche equals Singularity is a collective academic equation, and furthermore, it's rooted back to the Platonic Vedic cosmology, which are the pillars of Western and Eastern philosophy and religion. So the second obstacle is you can't have your own private religion. It has to be this collective immortality ideology. And the academic community is a collective community. So is the Platonic Vedic tradition. The Platonic dialogues, as I mentioned, were interwoven with the Bible, and Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars all borrowed from Plato's philosophy to help explain their own religions. So Psyche equals Singularity is resurrecting this ancient religious and philosophical tradition. To believe in the equation Psyche equals Singularity ties you back to the ground of Eastern and Western philosophy and religion. So the third obstacle that Psyche and Singularity helps us overcome while trying to believe in a new immortality ideology is that it provides precisely the kind of, this is a quote from Becker, merger of psychology and mythical religious perspective that Becker calls for within what is currently the most scientifically respected cosmology in academia, holographic string theory, and the related theory of the multiverse. So the third obstacle that we mentioned from Becker's book is that the scientific mind, even if it wants to believe in God, just can't. It just seems too primitive and superstitious. And I'm saying that is no longer the case. It hasn't been the case, in my opinion, for a while, but especially with the emergence of holographic string theory, with the idea of information conservation at the spherical horizon of the cosmos and a central singularity, which exists at each point of the encompassing sphere, that resurrects the Platonic and Vedic cosmologies, which are the foundations of Western and Eastern religion and philosophy. Combining Plato's Academy and Vedanta, uniting Eastern and Western wisdom. This class combines the Western Platonic academic method of developing knowledge of the psyche and the cosmos, culminating with the convergence of Carl Jung's psychology and Leonard Susskind's holographic string theory, with the Eastern Vedic yogic method of cultivating devotion to God, culminating with the Vedanta philosophy as presented in the Bhagavad Gita and other Vedic texts. Jnana Yoga and Bhakti Yoga. In Vedic terminology, this class uses Jnana Yoga, pronounced Jnana. It's spelt with a J-N-A-N-A, but it's pronounced like a G-Y, so Jnana Yoga. So in Vedic terminology, this class uses Jnana Yoga to prepare a person to engage in Bhakti Yoga. Yoga means to yoke together or unite. Jnana Yoga is a type of philosophical study aimed at liberating the eternal soul from falsely identifying with the temporary illusion of a material body. Bhakti Yoga is the attempt to reunite the eternal soul with the Supreme Soul by cultivating a spirit of loving, devotional service. So the whole goal of this class is to enable the students to have the confidence to see themselves as eternal heroes serving God on the cosmic stage, for the reasons we've discussed. And we're using Plato's philosophy from the West and Vedanta philosophy from the East to give us a roadmap on how to do that. So Jnana Yoga is philosophical study, bending the subtle material body, the mind, into certain conceptual shapes in order to prepare you to perceive the supersoul or Paramatma inside your own soul, or Atman. Paramatman and Atman, these are terms we'll be returning to later. So this philosophical speculation prepares the mind to then surrender to the Supreme Soul, and that's Bhakti Yoga, cultivating a spirit of loving devotional service to God. So this class, by studying these philosophical concepts, that's Jnana Yoga, but the entire thing is motivated by an underlying spirit of Bhakti Yoga, how to instill this sense of love of God. And we'll be discussing the possibility that even if there is no God, still, in order to have psychological health, you need to believe in God. And what's the difference between truth and reality in light of the implications of current physics? These are all topics we're going to discuss. I'm not trying to get anybody right off the bat to just say, okay, I didn't believe in God before I took this class, but now I'm going to believe in God. I am going to study all the various psychological options open to the human mind, but the overall class is being guided by Platonic philosophy and the Vedanta philosophy, specifically aimed at serving God. Perennial philosophy, the common source of all religion. Agostino Stucco, so 1497 to 1548, a bishop of the Catholic Church and head of the Vatican Library, first used the phrase perennial philosophy as a title for his treatise De Perenni Philosophia Libri, X, the 10th, 1540. It states that there is one principle of all things, of which there has always been one and the same knowledge among all peoples. So he's saying knowledge of God is innate in us all. No matter where you were born or when, there is one understanding of God, so says Agostino Stucco. The truth is lost over time and is only preserved in the Psyche Theologica, ancient theology. I think that's pronounced Psyche. And Agostino Stucco preferred Plato to Aristotle and saw Platonism as a forerunner of Christianity. So, as we were discussing in the previous slide, although we'll be focusing on Platonic philosophy and the Vedanta philosophy, and specifically the Vaishnava Vishnu worshipping branch of Vedanta philosophy, I'm not trying to get anybody in this class to accept either one of those worldviews as the absolute truth. It's just a guide for our heroic journey towards self-realization that's been time-tested and is furthermore historically the foundation stones for Western and Eastern philosophy. It's important here to note that Agostino Stucco, who came up with this idea of perennial philosophy, which is what I am suggesting that we think in terms of while we're taking this class, the difference between Plato and Aristotle comes down to the way they understood Plato's theory of the absolute ideas. these eternal forms of knowledge imprinted on everybody's soul, which is the same as Carl Jung's theory of the archetypes of the collective unconscious, at least in Jung's later development. At first, he talked about how these forms of knowledge might have evolved Darwinianly, but later, especially after his near-death experience in 1944, he just said his theory of the archetypes is the same as Plato's theory of absolute ideas. But for this slide, the main point is I'm teaching the class on the assumption that there are these eternal forms of knowledge that are the same in everybody's collective unconscious mind or their soul. Perennial philosophy or a specific religion. On the one hand, Jung, who adopted Plato's theory of absolute ideas, says that all of the various religions emerged from the same God archetype of the collective unconscious mind. On the other hand, Becker says that we need a specific religion that is shared by an entire culture in order to most effectively deny death by acting out our cosmic heroism before God. Becker quotes Philip Rieff, who says, "Abstractions will never do. God terms have to be exemplified. Men crave their principles incarnate in enactable characters, actual selective mediators between themselves and the polytheism of experience." So, to deny death and to embrace an immortality ideology, Becker is quoting Philip Rieff, who says, abstractions will never do. There has to be personal characters in the religion to whom human beings can relate on a personal level. So, is that our only alternative, or can we accept a perennial philosophy, which would say, although this one particular religion might describe God in this particular way with these particular characteristics, and this other religion has different descriptions of God, they all are rooted in the same idea of God imprinted on the soul. So that latter option, that all of the various religions are rooted in the same eternal idea of God, is the one guiding this class. Although, to give a full portrait of the way the idea of God has unfolded through history, I will be discussing the particulars of certain religions, especially the Vaishnava Krishna-worshipping branch of Hinduism. So Hinduism has three major branches: the Vishnu worshippers, the Vaishnava worshippers, and the Mother Goddess worshippers, the Shakti worshippers. So this class will be focusing on the Vaishnava branch of Hinduism, and in particular that branch of Vaishnavism which worships Krishna as the supreme form of Vishnu, and even more specifically the Gaudiya Vaishnava school of Vedanta founded by Chaitanya in the 16th century. But again, let me reiterate, I'm not expecting anybody to adopt any particular religion in this class. When I describe certain religions, it's just to fill out this perennial philosophy that there is the idea of God imprinted on everybody's soul. I am assuming that there is a God, but I'm not assuming that God is one particular form of God presented by one particular religion or another in this class. Psyche equals Singularity, the friend of all religions. The focus of this class is on Platonic and Vedic cosmology because they mirror the synthesis of Jungian psychology and holographic string theory so closely, and because they are the foundational pillars of Western and Eastern philosophy. We will examine how Platonism shaped Christian cosmology throughout the Middle Ages, then gave rise to the scientific revolution which displaced Christianity, but culminated in holographic string theory, which brings us back around to Plato. From the East, we will also see how Psyche equals Singularity conforms to Confucianism and Taoism. Psyche and Singularity, my book, I'm saying, is the latest iteration of the perennial philosophy, a common cultural framework within which to establish and or enhance faith in most, if not all, religions. Plato's Academy and the idea of the good. In 387 BCE, before the Common Era, Plato opened a school in an olive grove named Academia. He wrote dialogues featuring his martyred mentor Socrates. So here's a quote from The Apology, one of Plato's dialogues, which is depicting Socrates' trial before the assembly of Athens, who were accusing him of corrupting the youth and believing in gods of his own invention instead of the gods recognized by the state. So in his own defense, Socrates says, "It is my belief that no greater good has ever befallen you in this city than my service to my God. For I spend all my time going about trying to persuade you, young and old, to make your first and chief concern not for your bodies nor for your possessions, but for the highest welfare of your souls." The idea of the good. Through Socrates, Plato developed his theory that the temporary forms of the material world are like shadows of the eternal forms of knowledge in the spiritual world. In the Republic, Socrates says that all eternal forms, also called the absolute ideas, are contained in and radiate from the infinitely brilliant idea of the good. Following Pythagoras, Plato prescribed a mathematical curriculum to open the eye of the soul to the idea of the good. So I've discussed the idea of the good before, and I'll be discussing it many times in future slides. But the ultimate goal of philosophy, according to Socrates, as presented by Plato, especially in The Republic, which is Plato's most famous dialogue, is to open the eye of the soul to the idea of the good. He describes the idea of the good as this source of all of the other eternal forms of knowledge from which all of the temporary material forms that we can see radiate. He calls this form extremely bright, the source of light, the source of visible light, and the source of the light of consciousness itself. And as we'll see, the way Socrates describes the idea of the good parallels the way physicists describe the gravitational singularity, which gave birth to the universe at the Big Bang. It's a point of infinite density, infinite brilliance that contains all of space and time, so everything you can perceive with any of your five sense organs radiates from, ultimately, the gravitational singularity, which again I am equating with Plato's idea of the good. And Plato himself, following Pythagoras, has Socrates explain in The Republic a step-by-step mathematical curriculum to educate the mind, to open up the eye of the soul to this absolute idea of the good. Carl Jung and Leonard Susskind, Plato's academic curriculum. Jung, using the language of clinical psychology, adopted Plato's theory of absolute ideas, which he called archetypes of the collective unconscious. Jung said that the mandala, a circle or sphere with a central point, is the image that rises from the idea of the good, which Jung called the self-archetype in God. Susskind provided the mathematical description of the idea of the good, the omnicentric singularity and holographic horizon of the cosmos. So as we'll see when we go through Plato's dialogues one by one later in this class, Socrates describes the idea of the good, the soul of all being, the soul of the universe. In the Timaeus, he describes it as the central point of the spherical universe, which also encompasses the outermost sphere. And in his various dialogues, he says all of the absolute ideas exist at that outermost sphere, and that the three-dimensional forms we perceive are projected from those eternal ideas at the horizon of the cosmos. And then finally, in the Myth of Ur, a near-death experience, at the end of The Republic, he'll talk about threads of destiny, tethering each soul here on Earth and its geocentric, Earth-centric cosmology, tethering each soul in the central point of the universe out to the horizon of the cosmos, where that thread of destiny is woven by the three fates, the sisters who represent past, present, and future. So the point is that the equation Psyche equals singularity brings us full circle back to the Platonic dialogues, which set up the mathematical curriculum intended to open the eye of the soul to the idea of the good, which I'm saying is captured in the equation Psyche equals singularity, despite the fact that Leonard Susskind presents his theory as the antidote to the illusion of intelligent design, which is the subtitle of one of his books, The Cosmic Landscape. Constructing a theater for cosmic heroism. The cosmos is a holographic movie. So Ernest Becker, he quotes the father of American psychology, William James, 1842 to 1910. So William James says, mankind's common instinct for reality has always held the world to be essentially a theater for heroism. So this whole class, immortality and the unreality of death, and this hero's journey through philosophy, psychology, and physics. Now we're going to construct in our minds the theater, cosmic stage upon which to perform our heroics for the idea of an eternal God. We're going to go step by step through the evolution of physics to create this stage for cosmic heroism. History of the singularity. Physics sets the stage for cosmic heroism. In the following slides, I will trace out the history of physics leading to the Psyche equals singularity equation. From Newton's theory of gravity, 1687, to special relativity, 1905, general relativity, 1915, quantum mechanics, 1927, and the long-sought union of general relativity and quantum mechanics and holographic string theory, early 1990s. So the history of the gravitational singularity, this was one of the big chapters in my book, Psyche and Singularity. And this is the Jnana Yoga part of the class. We're going to start shaping our minds along this historical trajectory of the development of the human understanding of the cosmos. And we'll see how this mathematical evolution of the descriptions of the cosmos brings us back to Plato's theory of the idea of the good. I hope you are enjoying this hero's journey into the realm of philosophy, psychology, and physics. If you want to help me create more content like this, please subscribe and consider sponsoring me here on YouTube. You can also click the link to my website, psycheandsingularity.com, to sign up for a multiple-choice test with over 100 well-crafted questions related to this class, and links to the specific parts of each video where the answers can be found. If you take that test to the end, you will receive a certificate indicating that you have become a Psyche and Singularity scholar. In addition to access to that test, there is also the opportunity to answer essay questions that ask you to relate concepts covered in this class to your own hero's journey. I will personally respond to each of those essays, point out any other parts of this class that I think might bolster your plan. Finally, I want to point out that this course is sponsored by the Platonic Mystery School of the Divine Infinite Being, and you can check those guys out at divineinfinitebeing.com.